The sun blazed mercilessly over Tombstone's makeshift fairgrounds, casting long shadows between the weathered tents and rickety wooden booths. Dust kicked up by countless boots hung in the stifling air like a brown curtain, mixing with the scent of horse sweat, fried beans, and cheap whiskey. The traveling circus had arrived 3 days prior, bringing with it a collection of worn performers and faded dreams to the hard-scrabble mining town. Jake "Dead-Eye" Morrison sat motionless atop his black stallion at the edge of the crowd, his weathered duster coat hanging loose despite the heat. His steel-grey eyes, shadowed beneath the wide brim of his hat, surveyed the scene with the calculated wariness of a man who'd survived too many betrayals. The crowd's laughter echoed off the surrounding adobe buildings, but it carried an ugly edge that made his jaw tighten. At the center of the commotion stood a small wooden platform, barely 3 feet high. Upon it, a man no taller than a child performed tricks with surprising agility, juggling, tumbling, telling jokes with a voice that carried surprising depth and intelligence. But Thomas Little Tom Hartwell wasn't smiling. Jake could see it in the man's dark eyes, the way his shoulders held tension, despite the seemingly cheerful performance. This wasn't entertainment, it was survival. "Come on, tiny man, dance for us," shouted a burly miner, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey even from Jake's distance. "Yeah, earn your keep, you little freak." Another voice joined in, followed by cruel laughter that made Jake's hand unconsciously drift toward his Colt .45. Tom's performance never faltered, but Jake caught the almost imperceptible flinch, the way the smaller man's eyes darted toward the crowd's edge, as if calculating escape routes. Jake recognized that look. He'd worn it himself too many times, standing alone against hostile faces, feeling the weight of being different, unwanted, feared. The late afternoon light painted everything in shades of gold and amber, but the beauty of the desert sunset was lost on the increasingly agitated crowd. A group of cowboys from the Double R Ranch had been drinking since noon, and their jeers were growing bolder, more vicious. "I bet we could use him as a football," one of them called out, causing an eruption of drunken laughter. Jake's stallion, sensing his rider's tension, stamped restlessly. The gunslinger's reputation in these parts was well established. 7 confirmed kills in fair fights, countless others who'd simply decided to ride away rather than test their luck. Most folks gave him a wide berth, but his notoriety came at a price. Like Tom, he was an outsider, watched with suspicion and fear. Tom finished his routine with a graceful backflip, landing with arms outstretched. The applause was scattered and mocking. As he began to collect the few coins tossed onto the platform, the largest of the cowboys, a man called Bull Henderson, stumbled forward. "I didn't say you could stop, little man," Bull slurred, his massive frame swaying slightly. "I paid good money to see a show." "The show is over for today, sir," Tom replied with dignity, his voice steady despite the clear threat. "Perhaps tomorrow." "Perhaps now," Bull interrupted, reaching toward the platform. "Come here, Tiny. Let's see if you bounce." The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift from cruel entertainment to something darker. Tom stepped back, but the platform was small and there was nowhere to go. Jake watched as the smaller man's hand moved to something at his belt, a small knife barely visible. Tom wasn't going down without a fight, but they both knew how this would end. Bull's meaty hand grabbed Tom's arm, yanking him roughly off the platform. Tom stumbled but didn't fall, maintaining his balance with the practiced grace of a performer. But Bull wasn't done. His other hand drew back, ready to strike. The sound that cut through the desert air was unmistakable, the soft whisper of well-oiled leather as Jake's gun cleared its holster. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. "That's enough." Jake's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd never had to repeat himself. Bull's hand froze mid-swing. Every eye in the crowd turned toward the lone figure on horseback, noting the casual way the gun was held, the unwavering steadiness of his aim. Jake's reputation preceded him, and even Bull, drunk as he was, understood the gravity of the moment. "This ain't your business, Morrison," Bull growled, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm making it my business," Jake replied, his tone flat and final. He nudged his horse forward, never breaking eye contact with Bull. "Let him go!" The seconds stretched like hours. Bull's pride warred with his survival instinct, while the crowd held its collective breath. Tom remained perfectly still, understanding that any movement might tip this deadly balance. Finally, Bull's hand opened, releasing Tom's arm. "He ain't worth dying over," he muttered, trying to save face as he stepped back. Jake holstered his gun with fluid grace, then extended his left hand toward Tom. "Get up here," he said simply. Tom hesitated for just a moment, his eyes meeting Jake's. In that instant, something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared isolation. Tom grasped the offered hand and, with surprising agility, swung up behind Jake on the stallion's broad back. Jake looked down at Bull and his companions, his voice carrying across the silent fairgrounds like a warning. "Ride," he said to Tom, his words meant for everyone present. "You're with me now." Die, as they rode away from the fairgrounds, the dust from their horses' hooves settling in their wake. Neither man spoke. But Tom's hands gripped Jake's belt with the desperate strength of someone who'd just been thrown a lifeline. And Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like his worn duster coat. Behind them, the fair slowly came back to life, but the afternoon's events would be talked about in Tombstone saloons for weeks to come. Two outsiders had found each other in a moment of violence averted, and something had changed in the desert air, something that would reshape both their destinies. 3 days had passed since Jake pulled Tom from the fairgrounds, and they'd ridden hard across the unforgiving Arizona territory. The landscape stretched endlessly before them. Red mesas jutting from the earth like ancient monuments, saguaro cacti standing sentinel against the painted sky, and always the mountains in the distance, purple shadows promising both sanctuary and danger. They'd made camp in a narrow canyon, sheltered from both the wind and prying eyes. Jake's stallion, Thunder, grazed nearby on sparse desert grass, while a small fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. The silence between the two men had been comfortable for the most part, born of mutual respect rather than awkwardness. Tom sat cross-legged by the fire, his small hands expertly preparing coffee in Jake's battered tin pot. Despite his size, there was nothing childlike about his movements. Every gesture spoke of hard-won competence and years of fending for himself. Jake studied him covertly, noting the intelligence in those dark eyes, the way Tom's gaze constantly swept their surroundings, always alert. "You didn't have to do what you did back there," Tom said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice carried a slight accent, Boston, perhaps, or somewhere back east. Educated. "Bull Henderson's got friends. They'll be looking for you now." Jake poured whiskey from his flask into his coffee, the amber liquid catching the firelight. "Bull's had it coming for a long time. If it wasn't this, it would have been something else." He took a sip, feeling the burn travel down his throat. "Besides, a man's got to draw the line somewhere." Tom nodded slowly, understanding more than Jake had said aloud. "Still, you don't know me. I could be trouble you don't need." "Could be," Jake agreed, his grey eyes meeting Tom's directly. "But I've got a feeling trouble would have found me regardless. Always does." The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices rising and falling like a desert lament. Tom handed Jake a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly as the cup changed hands. "I wasn't always with the circus," Tom said after a long pause, staring into the flames. "Used to work for the railroad, believe it or not. Survey teams needed someone small enough to get into tight spaces, check tunnel supports, that kind of thing. Good work, honest work." His voice carried a note of loss. "Had a cabin outside Denver, decent money coming in, and thought I'd found my place in the world." Jake waited, sensing there was more to the story. Foreman's nephew needed a job. Guess who got let go to make room? Tom's laugh was bitter. Funny how quickly valuable employee becomes liability when it's convenient. ended up with the circus because it was the only work I could find. 5 years of being a sideshow attraction, listening to people laugh at me instead of with me. Jake studied Tom's profile in the firelight, seeing the weight of accumulated indignities, the gradual erosion of dignity that came from being treated as less than human. It was a feeling he understood intimately. "You ever kill a man, Tom?" The question hung in the desert air like smoke. Tom looked up sharply, surprised by the directness of it. "No," Tom replied honestly. "Came close a few times, but no." "You?" "More than I care to count," Jake said quietly. "Started when I was 16. Man in Kansas City thought my mother was easy prey because she was working in a saloon, trying to feed us after my father died. He was wrong." Jake's voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion. "Turned out I was faster with a gun than most men expected. Word got around. Before I knew it, every young hotshot looking to make a name for himself was coming after me." Tom absorbed this information without judgment. In the Old West, every man had his story, and most of them involved violence in some form. "The thing about reputation," Jake continued, "is it becomes its own kind of prison. People see you coming, they either run or they try to prove themselves. Either way, you end up alone." He took another sip of his coffee. "Gets mighty quiet, being the fastest gun in 3 territories. Is that what you are? The fastest?" Jake considered the question. "Fast enough to still be breathing, I suppose, but speed only gets you so far. Eventually you meet someone faster, or someone gets lucky, or you just get too old and too slow." He looked across the fire at Tom. "That's why I'm thinking it might be time for a change." "What kind of change?" "There's talk of a new railroad line being built through New Mexico territory. They'll need surveyors, engineers, men who know the land." Jake's eyes found Tom's. "And they'll need someone small enough to check those tunnel supports you mentioned." Tom felt something stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or just the memory of what hope used to feel like. "You serious about this?" "Serious as a loaded gun," Jake replied. "But first, we need to get out of Arizona. Bull wasn't bluffing about having friends, and they won't take kindly to what happened back in Tombstone. There's a town called Socorro, just over the New Mexico line. We can hole up there, see about those railroad jobs." Tom stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and shift. For the first time in years, the future held something other than endless humiliation and barely controlled desperation. But hope was a dangerous thing for a man who'd had it crushed too many times. "Why?" Tom asked quietly. "Why risk your life for a stranger? You could have ridden on, minded your own business. Nobody would have blamed you." Jake was quiet for so long that Tom thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Had a brother once. Samuel. He was born with a clubfoot, walked with a bad limp his whole short life. Kids used to follow him around town, mocking the way he moved, calling him names." Jake's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "I was off playing cowboy, thought I was too important to stick around and watch out for him. One day, some older boys cornered him by the creek, started pushing him around. Samuel fell, hit his head on a rock." The silence stretched between them like a desert highway. "He lived for 3 days after that, never woke up. I got home just in time to watch them put him in the ground." Jake's voice was steady, but Tom could hear the old pain underneath. "Swore I'd never stand by and watch someone get picked on again. Some promises you got to keep, even if they're made to ghosts." Tom felt the weight of that confession, the burden Jake had been carrying all these years. It explained the quick intervention at the fairgrounds, the immediate acceptance of a stranger, the willingness to share his campfire and his future plans. "I'm sorry," Tom said simply, and meant it. "Past is past," Jake replied, but they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The past had a way of riding alongside you, especially in the desert, where memories were as persistent as the heat. They sat in comfortable silence after that, 2 men bound together by circumstance and mutual understanding. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out its lonely question to the night. Tomorrow, They would ride toward New Mexico and whatever future awaited them there. But tonight, for the first time in years, neither man felt quite so alone in the vast expanse of the American West. Thunder nickered softly from where he was picketed, and Jake rose to check on the horse. As he moved around the camp, securing their gear and banking the fire, Tom watched him with new understanding. This wasn't just about helping a stranger or keeping an old promise. Jake Morrison, the famous gunslinger, was tired of being alone, tired of being defined by the men he'd killed and the reputation that followed him like a shadow. Maybe they could help each other find something better than what they were leaving behind. Maybe, in the morning light, the desert would look less like a wasteland and more like a pathway to somewhere new. Dawn came slowly to the New Mexico territory, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Jake had been awake for an hour, standing at the mouth of their canyon camp, watching the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who'd survived by never being caught off guard. The coffee was already brewing when Tom stirred from his bedroll, instantly alert despite the early hour. "Riders coming," Jake said without turning around. "Been watching their dust trail for the better part of an hour. 6, maybe 7 men, riding hard from the south." Tom was on his feet immediately, rolling his blanket with efficient movements. "Bull's friends?" "Most likely. They're following our trail, and they're not being subtle about it." Jake's voice remained calm, but his hand rested casually on his gun butt. "We've got maybe 30 minutes before they reach us." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, Tom proving surprisingly adept at the routine of frontier travel. Within 10 minutes, their gear was secured to Thunder's saddle, the fire was dead and scattered, and all traces of their presence were carefully erased. Jake helped Tom up onto the stallion's back, then swung up in front of him. "We're going to ride hard for the next few hours," he warned. "Can you handle it?" "I've handled worse," Tom replied, his small hands gripping Jake's belt. "Where are we headed?" "There's a trading post about 15 miles north called Esperanza. If we can reach it, we might be able to lose them in the crowd." Jake spurred Thunder into a gallop, and they burst from the canyon like a shot, heading across the open desert toward the distant mountains. The landscape blurred past them as Thunder stretched into his full stride. The stallion was magnificent, 16 hands of pure muscle and heart, bred for speed and endurance. Jake had paid 6 months' earnings for the horse 3 years ago, and Thunder had saved his life more times than he could count. Behind them, the dust cloud of their pursuers grew larger, more defined. Jake could make out individual riders now, 7 men, all mounted on good horses and gaining ground steadily. He recognized the lead rider's distinctive white hat and felt his jaw tighten. Bull Henderson himself leading the charge. "They're getting closer," Tom called out over the thunder of hooves. "I know." Jake leaned forward, urging Thunder to greater speed. The stallion responded magnificently, but Jake could feel the horse beginning to labor. They'd been riding hard for days, and even Thunder's legendary endurance had its limits. A rifle shot cracked across the desert, the bullet whining past Jake's ear to strike a boulder 50 yards ahead. The riders were within range now, close enough for lucky shots if not careful aim. "Can you shoot?" Jake called back to Tom. "Not from horseback at full gallop," Tom replied honestly. Jake made a quick decision, pulling Thunder toward a cluster of red rocks that jutted from the desert floor like ancient monuments. "We'll make our stand there. Better than being sitting ducks out in the open." They reached the rocks with their pursuers barely 100 yards behind. Jake swung down from Thunder's back and helped Tom dismount, then quickly led the horse to shelter behind the largest boulder. Tom grabbed Jake's rifle from its saddle holster while Jake checked his Colt and the spare gun in his belt. 7 against 2, Tom observed, trying to keep his voice steady. "I like those odds." Despite the danger, Jake found himself grinning. 7 against 1, you mean, unless you're planning to throw rocks at them. "I might surprise you," Tom replied, then grew serious. "Jake, if things go bad—" "They won't," Jake interrupted firmly. "We didn't come this far to die in the desert over Bull Henderson's hurt pride." The riders thundered into the rock formation, spreading out to surround their position. Jake recognized most of them. Cowboys from the Double R Ranch, a couple of drifters who'd been hanging around Tombstone saloons, and Bull himself, his face red with rage and exertion. "Morrison!" Bull's voice echoed off the rocks. "You made a mistake interfering with my business. Send out the little freak and maybe we'll let you ride away." Jake's response was a precisely aimed shot that sent Bull's hat spinning into the dirt. The message was clear. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse among the towering red rocks. The pursuers had numbers, but Jake had the advantage of position and superior marksmanship. His first shot dropped one of the cowboys clean from his saddle. His second winged another, sending the man fleeing back toward Arizona with a shattered arm. Tom proved more useful than either of them had expected. His small size allowed him to move between the rocks unseen, and his circus-trained agility let him reach vantage points that would have been impossible for a larger man. When one of the attackers tried to circle around behind Jake's position, Tom was waiting with a perfectly thrown rock that caught the man square in the temple, dropping him unconscious from his horse. "Behind you!" Tom's warning came just in time for Jake to spin and put 2 bullets into a cowboy who'd managed to climb the rocks above their position. The man tumbled backward with a scream that ended abruptly when he hit the ground. The battle lasted 20 minutes that felt like hours. When the dust settled, 3 men lay dead among the rocks, 2 had fled wounded, and Bull Henderson knelt behind his fallen horse with Jake's Colt pressed against his temple. "Please," Bull gasped, all his earlier bravado gone. "I got a wife, kids back in Tucson. Should have thought of that before you decided to terrorize innocent people," Jake replied coldly, but after a long moment he stepped back, holstering his gun. "Take your wounded and get out of here. If I see you again anywhere, I won't be so generous." Bull scrambled to his feet and ran for the nearest riderless horse, not bothering to look back. Within minutes, the survivors were disappearing toward the southern horizon, leaving their dead behind. Tom emerged from between the rocks, slightly dusty, but unharmed. "Is it over?" "This part is," Jake replied, reloading his weapons. "But word of this will spread. We need to get moving." As they prepared to leave the scene of the gunfight, Tom looked around at the scattered bodies. "Does it ever get easier? The killing, I mean." Jake considered the question while he checked Thunder for injuries. "No," he said finally, "and the day it does get easier is the day you need to hang up your guns and find another line of work." They buried the dead quickly. Frontier justice demanded that much courtesy, even for men who died trying to kill them. Then they mounted up and rode north toward Esperanza, leaving the red rocks and their grim memories behind. The trading post appeared on the horizon just as the sun reached its zenith, a cluster of adobe buildings surrounding a well and corral. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and they could see people moving about their business, traders, travelers, locals conducting the commerce that kept frontier settlements alive. "Looks peaceful," Tom observed. "Looks can be deceiving," Jake replied. "But it's civilization of a sort. We can rest here, resupply, maybe get word about those railroad jobs I mentioned." As they rode into Esperanza, Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. They'd survived their first real test as partners, and Tom had proven himself capable and brave under fire. Maybe there was hope for this unlikely alliance after all. But even as they dismounted at the trading post's hitching rail, Jake's eyes continued to scan the horizon. In the Old West, trouble rarely traveled alone, and he had a feeling their adventures were just beginning. Tom slid down from Thunder's back and looked up at his partner with newfound respect. Jake Morrison might be running from his past, but when push came to shove, he was still the deadliest man Tom had ever seen. And for the first time in his adult life, Tom felt safe. "What now?" Tom asked. Jake shouldered his saddlebags and looked toward the trading post's main building. "Now we find out what kind of future 2 men like us can build in New Mexico territory, and we do it together." The word "together" carried weight in the desert air, a promise and a commitment that both men understood. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it as partners, bound by mutual respect and the kind of loyalty that could only be forged in gunfire and tested under the merciless western sun. 6 months later, the sound of dynamite echoing through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains had become as familiar as morning coffee to Jake Morrison and Tom Hartwell. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was pushing its line through some of the most challenging terrain in the American West, and the two unlikely partners had found their place in that grand enterprise. Jake stood at the edge of the construction camp, watching the morning shift prepare for another day of blasting through solid rock. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and distant snow from the high peaks, a welcome change from the dust and heat of Arizona. His gun belt still hung at his hip. Old habits died hard, but his hands were more often occupied with surveying equipment and engineering reports than with deadly iron. "Jake, the tunnel's ready for inspection." Tom's voice carried clearly across the camp, and Jake smiled involuntarily. His partner had taken to the railroad work like he'd been born to it, his small stature making him invaluable for checking the dangerous work inside partially completed tunnels and mine shafts. Jake made his way to the tunnel entrance, noting how the other workers greeted Tom with genuine respect and camaraderie. It had taken time. Railroad crews could be as rough and judgmental as cowboys, but Tom's competence and courage had won them over. The man who'd once been mocked as a circus freak was now considered one of the most valuable members of the survey team. "What's the verdict?" Jake asked as Tom emerged from the tunnel, his clothes dusty, but his expression satisfied. "Support beams are solid, no water seepage, and the rock face is stable for the next blast," Tom reported professionally. "But I found something you need to see." Jake followed Tom back into the tunnel, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. About 50 feet in, Tom stopped and pointed to a section of the wall where the rock face had been carefully cleared of debris. "Look at this," Tom said, holding his lantern close to the wall. Jake peered at the spot Tom indicated and felt his breath catch. Carved into the stone, weathered but still clearly visible, were markings that looked like ancient symbols. Definitely not the work of Spanish explorers or mountain men. "Apache?" Jake asked. "Maybe. Or Pueblo. The foreman needs to know about this. If this is a sacred site, we'll have to reroute the entire line through this section." Tom's voice carried no frustration at the potential setback, just the practical acceptance of a man who'd learned to work with the land rather than simply conquer it. They made their way back to the camp headquarters, a large tent that served as both office and meeting place for the construction supervisors. Inside, they found Chief Engineer Patrick O'Sullivan hunched over his maps, his Irish accent still thick despite 20 years in America. "Gentlemen, what can I do for you?" O'Sullivan looked up from his charts, his weathered face creasing into a smile. The engineer had been initially skeptical of hiring a former gunslinger and a circus performer, but their work over the past months had made them indispensable to the project. "We found markings in the tunnel, Mr. O'Sullivan," Jake reported. "Looks like Indian petroglyphs. Might be a sacred site." O'Sullivan's expression grew serious. The railroad company had learned hard lessons about respecting Native American territory, both from a moral standpoint and from the practical reality that angry tribes could make construction impossible. "Show me," the engineer said, reaching for his coat. The three men made their way back to the tunnel, where O'Sullivan examined the markings with the careful attention of a man who understood their significance. After several minutes, he straightened and nodded slowly. "These are definitely ceremonial markings, probably Pueblo, maybe 200 years old or more." He looked at Jake and Tom with respect. "A good eye catching these before we blasted through here. I'll need to contact the tribal council, see about getting permission to continue or finding an alternate route." "How long will that take?" Tom asked. "Could be weeks, could be months," O'Sullivan replied honestly. "But it's the right thing to do, and it's company policy. Better to build the railroad with the tribe's blessing than to fight a war over every mile of track." As they walked back toward camp, Jake found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that dusty day in Tombstone. He'd traded his reputation as a deadly gunfighter for something far more valuable: respect earned through honest work and integrity. The transition hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when his past threatened to catch up with him, but Tom's steady presence and unwavering loyalty had made all the difference. "Penny for your thoughts," Tom said, walking beside him with the easy gait of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Jake replied. 6 months ago we were running from Bull Henderson and his boys. Now we're helping build the future. Tom smiled, understanding the weight behind those simple words. "You know what I realized the other day? I haven't thought about the circus in weeks. Used to be, I'd wake up every morning remembering what I'd lost, what people had taken from me. Now I wake up thinking about what we're building." They'd reached their small cabin at the edge of the construction camp, modest quarters they shared by choice rather than necessity. The railroad company had offered separate accommodations, but both men had discovered they preferred each other's company to solitude. Jake poured coffee from the pot that always seemed to be brewing on their small stove, handing a cup to Tom before settling into his favorite chair by the window. Through the glass, he could see the partially completed railroad line stretching toward the mountains, a testament to human determination and ingenuity. "Got a letter from Denver yesterday," Tom said casually, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "From the Territorial Surveyor's Office. They're looking for qualified men to help map the water rights for the new settlements." Jake looked up with interest. "Government work? Territorial, not federal?" "Not. Good pay, steady work, and they specifically mentioned they need someone who can get into the narrow canyon areas." Tom's eyes met Jake's. "They're offering us both positions if we're interested." Jake considered this development. Railroad work was honest and satisfying, but it was also temporary. Once this section of track was complete, they'd have to move on to the next project, always following the construction crews across the frontier. Government surveying work would offer stability, a chance to put down roots in a territory that was rapidly becoming a state. "What do you think?" Jake asked. "I think it sounds like the kind of work two partners could build a future on," Tom replied. "Good, honest work that uses our skills without anyone having to get shot." Jake laughed at that, remembering the days when every problem seemed to require a gun to solve. "When do they need an answer?" "Next month. The current surveying season runs through spring, then we'd have time to think about whether we want to stay on permanently." Tom set down his coffee cup and looked directly at his partner. "Jake, I want you to know something. What you did for me back in Tombstone, pulling me up on that horse, giving me a chance at something better, it saved my life. Not just from Bull Henderson, but from giving up on myself entirely." Jake felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Works both ways, partner. You helped save me from becoming nothing but a reputation with a gun attached to it. So what do you say? Ready to become respectable government employees?" Jake raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To Tom Hartwell and Jake Morrison, Territorial Surveyors. Has a nice ring to it." They clinked cups, sealing their decision with the simple ceremony of two men who'd learned to trust each other completely. Outside their window, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall on the mountains, dusting the peaks with white and promising a long, quiet season ahead. That evening they sat by their fire and wrote their acceptance letter to the Territorial Surveyor's Office. As Jake sealed the envelope, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point. A gunslinger running from his reputation and a circus performer fleeing from humiliation had found something neither had expected: a true partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. The Old West was changing slowly but inevitably. The days of lawless frontier towns and endless gunfights were giving way to civilization, to railroads and territorial governments and surveyors' maps. Some men fought that change, clinging to the wild freedom of earlier times. But Jake and Tom had chosen to embrace it, to help build the future rather than mourn the past. As the fire burned low and the mountain wind whispered through the pine trees, both men felt the deep satisfaction that comes from honest work and genuine friendship. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they would face them together as partners in every sense of the word. The gunslinger had hung up his reputation along with his fear of the future. The circus performer had traded humiliation for dignity and respect. And in the growing territory of New Mexico, two unlikely friends had found something rarer than gold or silver. They had found home. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the mountains, carrying the promise of progress and the sound of a nation growing ever westward. Jake Morrison and Tom Hartwell listened to that sound and smiled, knowing they had played their part in building the rails that would carry America into the 20th century. The desert had taught them to survive. The mountains had taught them to thrive. And their friendship had taught them that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can forge the strongest bonds, lasting long after the dust settles and the legends fade away.